Welcome to Tangents, a podcast based on a series of odd conversations between two friends. On August 12th, white supremacists and neo-Nazis gathered in Charlottesville, Virginia, under the guise of protesting the removal of a statue of Robert E. Lee in Emancipation Park in historic downtown. The event, called Unite the Right, descended into carnage as far-right activists attacked counter-protesters. One far-right activist drove a car into a group of left-wing activists, murdering Heather Heyer and injuring 19 others. Clashes were broken up by police. Governor Terry McAuliffe declared a state of emergency, and the event was declared an illegal gathering. However, before the day was done, dozens more were injured. 2 Virginia state troopers died in a helicopter crash, believed to be mechanical failure, and 4 arrested, including 20-year-old James Fields, the suspect in Heyer's murder. The previous night, far-right activists paraded across the grounds of the University of Virginia a few miles from the park, carrying torches and shouting racist and anti-Semitic slogans. Just across the street at St. Paul's Episcopal Church, more than 500 attended a multi-faith service in opposition to hate, attended by Cornel West. Far-right activists were reportedly kept from entering the church by counter-protesters. Unite the Right was the largest gathering of white supremacists in the United States in more than 20 years. It marks the ascendancy of the far-right sentiment since the election of Donald Trump, who refused to specifically condemn white supremacists and neo-Nazis for more than 48 hours after, and then reiterated a hateful false equivalency at a surreal press conference on Tuesday. Joining me is someone who knows quite a bit about the extreme right. Hello, Josh.
Hello, Thomas. And if I might make a little bit of an addendum onto that point about the Tuesday press conference.
Sure.
In a statement today, President Trump says that he felt liberated by that press conference and that it was another blow against the hateful left-wing fake news media.
Not particularly surprising. Once again, he's blaming the
really
media for misinterpreting, I think, a pretty unambiguous statement that he made where he said there were good people attending this rally in the Unite the Right side, and when he refused to condemn Nazis and the Ku Klux Klan, seemingly the easiest thing for the president of the United States to do.
Yeah, you would assume this would be uncontroversial, but I suppose not.
Well, there has been widespread condemnation across the United States, not just among the Democratic Party and leading Democratic politicians, but among many Republicans as well.
That
I should add leaders of business, of big businesses, including on Trump's economic councils. The
Now
CEO of
disbanded
Merck,
economic council.
notably after the CEO of Merck stepped down, business leaders left his councils and the president disbanded them. So there has been pretty widespread condemnation. Even the vice president, who did specifically condemn the Ku Klux Klan and neo-Nazis, but seemed to justify the president's statements, maybe misleadingly suggesting that the president was standing up against these groups when he seems to be reluctant to really condemn them. But I want to broaden things out a little bit and go to a little house cleaning, if we might.
All right.
So on this podcast, I'd say we're engaged in an effort to seek the truth about the crazy things that are going on in this country and the world. Would you say that's true, Josh?
Yes, we are big fans of the truth here at Tangents.
And getting things right is more important to us than being right.
Yeah.
The first episode we did.
I know where you're going with this, and I don't
the first episode we did of this podcast, which we strongly recommend listening to, dealt with the alt-right. And in that episode, I asked you, Josh, specifically to define what the alt-right is.
And I defined it as culturally deterministic.
Yeah, and who is in the alt-right. I think in the episode, you drew a sort of delineation between what you consider most of the alt-right to be culturally deterministic, as you were just saying,
yes,
and those who are racially deterministic. Do you think it's time in the wake of this tragedy, not just who we saw in Charlottesville, but who the reaction that has been witnessed on alt-right social media to make a revision of that definition?
Yeah, I think it's time to go even a step further than that and say not only am I wrong today, but I was wrong when I made the delineation in the first place. And I can
We were not wrong, I should add, to say that there are large numbers of people who subscribe to the idea of cultural determinism.
No,
But I
that's
think where we
entirely
were wrong is that there does seem to be a much broader group of people that thinks that human behavior is determined by race, and that that's what's driving this violent ethno-nationalism.
Yes, and I think that it's important to point out another important distinction, which is to say that I wasn't wrong when I said that the alt-right believes in cultural determinism. What I was wrong about was the alt-right's definition and understanding of culture.
Yeah.
I was using a liberal understanding of culture, where culture is something that can be changed and is not necessarily innate to a certain group of people. The alt-right, on the other hand, seems to think that culture is entirely innate and that it cannot be easily changed or altered. And when you have culture that's essentially unchangeable, what you're talking about is just another better, more acceptable form of racism.
Yes. And we should be clear. I think what we saw in Charlottesville on Saturday was and I should mention that I was not present at the rally, but I was present in Charlottesville that day.
I should mention that I was not present at the rally, nor was I present at Charlottesville. I left a week earlier.
Both of us are UVA alumni.
Yes.
And are very familiar with this part of the world. This is a very personal topic for us both.
Exactly.
But what we saw at this rally was probably the worst of the worst, the most extreme ideology
yes, I would agree with that
imaginable in
entirely.
American society. These were openly neo-Nazi groups. These were openly white supremacist groups. These were groups that advocate not only violence, but genocide. I don't know that I would say that characterizes the broader spectrum of people who carry racist views on the alt-right.
I would agree with that.
But it does lead one to ask the next question. Do you think the alt-right is essentially a violent movement, Josh? Determined it's a racist movement. Do you think it's a violent movement?
Do I think that the alt-right is inherently a violent movement?
I'm not saying that everybody who subscribes to alt-right beliefs is necessarily destined to commit terrorism. I'm asking you if the ultimate outcome of this ideology is violence. And if this ideology advocates, endorses, embraces, excuses, harbors, or in any other way condones violence.
I mean, I have to answer that it has to be violence. The ultimate outcome of this ideology has to be violence. In order for the alt-right to get to a point where they are content with how society works, there has to be violence, because unfortunately, Thomas, I'm kind of forced to eat a lot of crow here. The alt-right.
Well, it's not. We should say the alt-right is what I would call a nebulous characterization,
yes,
or a nebulous grouping. There are a lot of different groups of people on the alt-right. And we have this discussion a lot on tangents about these kind of blanket or umbrella terms that we throw over different groups with heterodox beliefs. Even though I'm characterizing the alt-right as broadly racist and broadly violent,
that does not mean that every single member of the alt-right is racist, nor does it mean that every single member of the alt-right is violent.
No, but it is predominant. We did not make that distinction before. We are now prepared to say that it is predominantly racist, and that it predominantly condones or endorses violence.
It predominantly
even if people
defends violence.
Yes.
Thomas.
Yeah. Even if not everyone commits it.
I didn't want to mention some of the information that I obtained from my anthropological research circles, but let's just say that Donald Trump's condemnation of the alt-left and anti-fascist groups as predominantly
the so-called Antifa or Antifa.
Antifa.
I've heard it Antifa. I've heard it Antifa recently.
Antifa? Do you prefer
Antifa?
I think it's Antifa because it's anti-fascism, or maybe it's
I don't know. I think it's either Antifa or Antifa. But the distinction, and we'll get into this a bit when we talk about President Trump. I want to talk more about them first. But the distinction is that whatever Antifa or Antifa activists do, and some of them have embraced violence. They don't really subscribe to a violent ideology, and there really isn't a comparison, and there certainly wasn't a comparison this past weekend between the two groups.
Not a valid
groups that are broadly committed to resisting racism, groups that are broadly committed to racial equality. I don't care how crazy you think the economic views of groups like the Democratic Socialists of America are. There's no comparison between them and neo-Nazis.
No,
none.
Absolutely not.
There's no moral comparison whatsoever.
But Thomas,
it's really hateful and misleading to suggest that there is. But you were making a point.
Absolutely, yeah. And this is actually one that I don't think you've heard before either, or perhaps you have. But there were people in my anthropological research circles, as we call the groups of
members on the alt-right that you've observed.
Members of the alt-right that I observe and interact with on the internet, yes. And it is important to point out that
we should just state again, Josh is not a member of the alt-right. Josh is more taking the kind of risks that a nature documentary maker does when viewing a pack of lions in Saharan Africa. But yeah, you're observing them in their natural habitat on Tumblr and 4chan. Okay.
Anyway.
Yeah. But in what you've observed on these little alt-right safaris of yours, I'm going to make jokes about wearing brown khaki, but I think that would be going a bit far.
Thomas, please, God.
But from what you've observed of their reactions, in all seriousness, what have you seen?
Well, I'm going to start talking about stuff I saw before Charlottesville, which I now can connect a lot better. At first, I thought this was an isolated belief, but it's really not. Back when Black Lives Matter protests were significantly larger than they are now, summer of 2016, I believe, my anthropological research circle started to condone, endorse, and outright support the idea of running over protesters who are blocking the street.
We should mention, so this is directly, this is directly describing what happened in Charlottesville.
This is directly describing what happened in Charlottesville.
Yeah, and it's a common protest tactic for people to block streets.
It is a very common protest tactic for people to block streets. It is illegal, but...
it's a common act of civil disobedience, though. It's a good way to get attention.
It is a common act of civil disobedience. It is a good way to get attention. And as a supporter of the rule of law, not the supporter of the rule of law on tangents, Thomas quite likes the rule of law as well, but as the rule of law expert on tangents,
as the lawyer, he's just saying he's a lawyer.
I'm not a lawyer. You do not.
He's a lawyer.
Not yet. I do not. You do not. I do not.
He's a judge, too.
No one does not. Or no one is not able to take the law into their own hands and decide whether or not you are going to seriously injure or kill a person with your car because you are inconvenienced by their presence.
That's vigilantism.
That's vigilantism.
And there's a distinction between that and civil disobedience. The people who are blocking the streets are breaking the law, but they're knowingly breaking the law and will face the consequences as an act of protest.
Yes.
They're not hurting anybody they're inconveniencing people, but they're not hurting anybody by blocking the streets. That's a very common tactic. If you have a cause that you're strongly committed to, as much as I hate waiting in traffic, and I've been stuck in traffic before because protesters were blocking the streets.
As have I.
It's a very common tactic, and it's very justifiable, provided you're willing to face the consequences. And there's no comparison, no distinction, no way any sane person can say there's a difference there's any similarity or equivalency between that and killing people.
No, there is not.
But you saw this online well before it happened,
Thomas,
and people were endorsing it.
Memes about this that were created, pictures of people locking arms, being dispelled by a car speeding past at 35, 45 miles an hour. People left flattened on the street with the caption, and excuse me for my language, but I'm just quoting, "Beep, beep, motherfuckers, get out of the way."
I should add, this is what the Egyptian military did to protesters in 2014. Yeah. They ran them over.
And it is.
This is what happens in authoritarian countries.
It is inexcusable. It cannot be done in this way. It's incredibly disturbing. And I also saw similar defenses of what happened in Charlottesville. I saw 4chan posts where people were pointing out that the protesters were blocking the street and they didn't have a permit.
We'll get into the murder and carnage in Charlottesville in a second, but I think the point that you're trying to underlie here is that this isn't just isolated, specifically
it's not
to
just
James Fields or to the groups that were in Charlottesville, or to extreme neo-Nazis. There is a broad group of people in American society who endorse violence against a different ideological group that they see as threatening.
Well,
this is fair. It is a fair point when discussing the alt-right to say that they are violent and that they endorse violence.
Well, they claim to condemn political violence in general. However, they absolutely condone violence in self-defense. And the problem with the alt-right is that they see themselves as under attack constantly.
Yeah, can you just briefly outline, like, maybe legally and philosophically, your attitudes towards self-defense and how that squares with with the perverted way that the alt-right sees the world?
My attitudes towards self-defense are very, very
simple. Because a reasonable person can say, like, if I'm being mugged and somebody pulls a knife on me, if I'm under attack physically, I do have a right to defend myself, both legally and both legally and philosophically.
Yes,
I don't ever say morally when I'm talking about using violence, but
don't do that.
Because that's a tricky word to go down. But philosophically speaking and legally speaking, if somebody's under attack, they should have the right to defend themselves. But the issue is one of perception, I would imagine you're going to say, and that's everything probably.
The issue is
your attitude and then the alt-rights.
Yeah, the issue is definitely one of perception. My attitude mirrors the Commonwealth of Virginia's law code on the matter, which is essentially that, and I know, very much a shocker, which is essentially that self-defense is only justifiable if it is both reasonable and necessary. If you are under an imminent threat of overt action, and you respond with a reasonable amount of force based on your perception of the threat, and, most importantly, and the actuality of the threat to your person, then you have engaged in a legal act of self-defense. The problem is that the alt-right perceives threats to exist when they do not exist as an overt action, and we will get to this when we talk about what I can describe as either an act of terrorism or an act of murder. Take your pick, or both.
Both. Because you can commit terrorism without killing people.
Yes, in which that driver made a snap judgment that he was under a lethal threat and took action when no such threat existed. That is the best way that I can describe how the alt-right views these scenarios.
Yeah, so the alt-right, and we should say in our previous episodes, even though we've made some amendments to our definitions today, we still have a lot of good analysis in the first episode of our podcast and an episode on a CNN video from President Trump and in other episodes. Yes. The alt-right has a deep siege mentality. They thrive on the idea that all of American society is against them. And really all of American society is not against them, particularly very American in a strong position of power right now.
We particularly discussed this in the CNN episode. Where...
they thrive on this idea that they are under siege.
Yes.
And their threat perception is, to put it mildly, faulty. Faulty is probably not strong enough a word here.
You're being too polite, Thomas.
Yeah, it's, and I don't want to insult people with schizophrenia, but it is almost a schizophrenic line of attack. They have paranoid delusions. Is the only way one can describe the way they perceive other people attacking them. And when you attack somebody when no actual threat exists, it's not self-defense.
It's assault, battery, or murder, depending on how far you get. And
exactly.
And furthermore, They know sometimes.
I should also say there's a long history of violent groups claiming self-defense to justify murder.
Gee, I wonder why that might be. Maybe it's
And
because
there's a really famous group, and there's a really famous group there's a really famous political movement in Germany in the 1930s that did just this.
Oh, I remember that one.
Yes,
what's
the National
Socialists?
Yeah,
The
the
National
Nazis.
Socialists.
Yeah.
Anyway, and important thing to point out is that even if they understand that there was in fact no threat, they create a culture of threat. This is what we mean by a siege mentality. They talk about the fact that anti-fascist protesters attacked them at Berkeley, that the Black Bloc threw fire
We're gonna probably get into kind of left-wing opposition movements in a different episode, but can you briefly describe what Antifa or Antifa is, but just firstly answer me the question, is there any comparison in the two sides between numbers? We've already established that there is a moral distinction between Antifa, and there are some violent activists within Antifa, but the vast majority are not violent. But is there an equivalency in numbers? And we've certainly established there's no equivalency in terms of ideology. But is there an equivalency in numbers? What do they believe in?
I'm a little less certain on the equivalency in numbers. I'm very inclined to say there's not, especially because
there hasn't visibly been. There certainly wasn't in Charlottesville.
There was definitely not in Charlottesville. There was significantly more white supremacists than there were counter-protesters.
But do you think this view of the alt-right that there are Antifa activists everywhere who are constantly threatening them, very violently predisposed anarchists, which is essentially how they would view them?
I think that's a little ridiculous, Thomas.
Yeah. So this threat is not justified then?
No, it's not justified. The only threat
and by the way, another thing the Nazis did was claim that there are violent left-wing spies and terrorists everywhere.
I wonder. Anyway, the only threat that anti-fascists pose to white supremacists, KKK members, and Nazis is when they are standing next to them with bats about to hit them.
Yeah.
Simply protesting, simply stating that you do not agree with Nazis and that you may support political violence against
And the vast
Nazi
majority
movements
of rallies that we've seen from left-wing groups in recent years, from Occupy Wall Street to Black Lives Matter,
have been mostly
nonviolent. The incident in Berkeley didn't even involve Antifa activists. It involved a very fringy anarchist group
called the Black Bloc.
Yeah, called the Black Bloc. And the Black Bloc is a small group.
The Black Bloc is a small group, and the Black Bloc is an anarchist group that equally protests Democratic and Republican administrations. They burned things in Washington, D.C. when Obama was inaugurated.
True or false, the Black Bloc is not Antifa, and Antifa is not the Black Bloc?
I would say that's true. The Black Bloc is anti-fascist, but they're not Antifa.
So the alt-right's view is unjustified.
The alt-right's view is entirely unjustified because they turn the threat of violence into the actuality of violence. Yes, they are threatened reasonably often by anti-fascist protesters, but a threat is not actionable on for self-defense. Again, under the law, you must have an overt action and it must be tangible.
All right, so I think we've done a good job of establishing what self-defense actually is.
Yes.
And that it wasn't, what was going on here was not self-defense. So I want to get specifically into what happened in Charlottesville on Saturday.
Okay.
So maybe you could talk about how events unfolded. I gave a brief description at the beginning, and very sadly maybe discuss what happened, the murder by James Fields of Heather Heyer and the injury of so many other activists, and then discuss what the alt-right's reaction has been and why this has fueled our very concerning view.
Okay.
And we'll talk about Trump after that.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've mainly been talking about the events on Saturday and general philosophical points. But if we're going to talk about what actually happened in Charlottesville, we need to start with the torchlit march on Friday evening. And
terrifying.
We actually need to go back a little further. So, in May of 2017, Richard Spencer organized a
Y'all remember him?
Yeah, a much smaller. By the way, he's still only been punched 3 or 4 times, I think. It hasn't gone up in a while.
We'll keep you updated.
Yeah, it may go up very soon. Organized a much smaller torch-based march and torch lighting ceremony around the Lee statue in the recently renamed Emancipation Park, formerly Lee Park. And it was considered to be a great success. It was a fantastic recruiting tool for the white supremacists and the alt-right. Which,
they considered it.
Well, I mean, it boosted their publicity significantly. And yes, they did consider it to be a great success. So then you have Richard Spencer coordinates with James Kessler to organize this Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville.
So Kessler was the chief organizer here and gave that infamous press conference, which we'll talk about in a minute.
Kessler was the chief organizer and gave the infamous press conference, which did not go well for him. And so part of the reason why Charlottesville was selected is because Richard Spencer is an alumnus of our fair University of Virginia.
We should add that Richard Spencer, there are many better people who've come from UVA, and Richard Spencer doesn't represent UVA in any way. But we have the unfortunate coincidence of having attended the same alma mater as Richard Spencer. The extremely unfortunate coincidence.
Actually, there's several petitions to get Richard Spencer's degree revoked to the University of Virginia.
I'm sure.
I would assume that President Sullivan is probably really considering that, to be honest with you.
I'd be interested to know if there's a mechanism to do that, but we're digressing.
We're going onto a tangent here,
which we're entirely entitled to do on this podcast.
But it's important that we get through what happened in this.
Yeah. So Kessler and Spencer.
So Kessler and Spencer organized the protest. Mostly Kessler, a little bit Spencer. They organized speakers to come talk in Lee Park on Saturday from 12 to 5.
Emancipation Park.
Pardon me. I used the old name. Emancipation Park from 12 to 5. They organized. They got the word out to a bunch of right-wing publications, from Breitbart to the Daily Stormer to forum posts on Stormfront and 4chan, and they said that everyone can bring whatever they want, whatever makes them feel safe, but a torch was a must because they were doing a massive torch lighting ceremony in front of the Lee statue in Emancipation Park. A group of white supremacists.
We should add, torches have a pretty ominous connotation when it comes to white supremacists.
They do.
And Nazis.
They do, even when they're tiki torches that were probably swiped from their mom's backyard. Or bought from a hardware store. But
we should add, just as a plug for another media source that we're fond of, Vice News did a wonderful documentary on the events in Charlottesville that's been circulating on social media. It's an HBO production, but it's freely available on YouTube. It's a little over 20 minutes. It is not easy to watch, but we strongly recommend this if you wish to find out more and to really see firsthand what the events in Charlottesville looked like, how chaotic it was, and how frightening some of the characters were at these events.
So then you had, we're on Friday at this point, and we're going to gloss over the legal challenge to the permit for the alt-right groups and the fact that they were given a permit, because we're going to talk about that with the state of emergency that was declared on Saturday.
Well, we will.
So basically, the alt-right begins to gather in Lee Park, other parks, other points around the city of Charlottesville, and they determine that they're going to hold a torchlight march, which the University of Virginia did in fact know about. They were originally going to be allowed on grounds. They were supposed to gather in Nameless Field, march up University Avenue, which is one of a main thoroughfare for UVA students. It's where a lot of shops are, called the Corner, and gather on the north side, which is the back of the rotunda. Instead, they decided to march up McCormick Road, which is where student housing is, onto the
We should add
lawn.
classes are not in session at this point.
Classes are not in session. They don't start until next week.
I can't imagine what would have happened had they done this rally a few weeks later.
Well, I don't think the march would have gotten as far as it did.
Yeah.
They got onto the lawn, which I believe is a National Heritage Site.
Yes, it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
A UNESCO World Heritage Site. And began to protest surround the rotunda and surround a statue of Thomas Jefferson, which was guarded by about 20 to 25 student protesters from Black Lives Matter and other student organizations who were linking arms and protecting the statue. Now, originally, this was supposed to be the second phase of an already successful march. As Thomas said, they were originally supposed to go to an interfaith service.
Yeah.
They had timed it to occur at about the point when the We Shall Overcome song began, and they intended to drown out We Shall Overcome with chants of white power, white lives matter, and go home. I think you know what word what word they would have used here, and it's not pretty.
Yes.
Instead,
we won't repeat it, but no, it was.
I will not use
that word. That word and many other horrible words were used a lot this past weekend.
They were very fond of calling their political adversaries and counter protesters animals, and gorillas. Anyway, so.
In addition to this, yes. I think referencing the statue, they began shouting, "You will not remove us.
You will not replace us.
You will not replace us." But it became Jews will not replace us. Yes. So real, visible, visceral anti-Semitism in addition to horrific racism.
This was probably directed at Charlottesville Mayor. Was it Michael Singer?
Yes.
Michael Singer, who is in fact a Jew, or has like a Jewish sounding name at the very least. That's all that the alt-right really needs, in all honesty.
We should add that the deputy mayor of Charlottesville,
West Bellamy,
who's African American, had to have his whereabouts hidden over the weekend. Bellamy has been at the forefront of the efforts to remove the statue of Robert E. Lee and has received many, many, many death threats from across the country.
Many death threats, people searching through his social media accounts to find anything that might be remotely considered racist towards white people. And he was specifically targeted as the reason why the statue is coming down.
Yeah, he has been at the forefront of the effort to remove Lee. So there's real reason to believe that his life was threatened. I believe he did not actually leave Charlottesville this weekend, though. He didn't want to leave.
He refused. So it's important to point out what was being said while they marched on the University of Virginia. They were chanting blood and soil, which doesn't sound nearly as bad as their other chants until you understand.
Explain why that's so horrible, Josh.
Well, it was something that Adolf Hitler had taught the Nazi Party to chant in Germany during the 1920s and 1930s.
But in relation to their and the Nazi connotations here is obvious, but explain this in relation to their objectives.
Why don't you give us a history lesson here, Thomas?
Well, it's my understanding that these groups advocate an ethno-state.
Yes.
They see North America as being an intrinsically white European land, and they wish all non-European peoples to leave. It has it bears a lot of similarity to Hitler's ideas about kind of a Volksland in Germany, about the Vaterland, the fatherland, about Lebensraum, the living space in Eastern Europe. So it is an old idea that land and territory can be directly connected to an ethnic group or a race that has deeply ethnic connotations, and that the only way for a group to really be successful is to sort of cleanse or purify the land of anyone who doesn't come from this race or ethnic group, and that has very genocidal connotations.
Absolutely. Blood comes from the soil. That's kind of the idea here. So that might in fact be the worst chant they've made. They surrounded the statue of Thomas Jefferson. It's unknown who threw the first punch, but violence.
This is on Friday we're talking about.
On Friday, not on Saturday yet. On Friday, violence began between, I would say, over 100 white supremacist, white nationalist supporters with torches in front of a statue of Thomas Jefferson, and maybe 20 to 25 students who were trying to protect the statue.
At this point, I believe the police started to get involved.
After the skirmish had been going on for a little bit, campus security determined that the white nationalist group had in fact breached the rules of UVA and removed them from campus, not remove them from grounds, not before one of the deans of the university was actually hit in the arm with a torch. This is utterly unacceptable. It's an absolute disgrace.
And at this point, the story was already starting to pick up global attention. And we'll talk more about the global view of this event in a bit, particularly after we talk about the President of the United States' reaction.
Oh
but
God.
We're still on Friday here.
We're still on Friday here. Counter-protesters were very upset with the police. They thought that they hadn't come soon enough. And
criticism we'll also get to in a minute.
Criticism we will also get to probably in a few minutes. And that essentially ended the festivities, if you will, on Friday night. Saturday morning, even though the protest was slated to start at 12 o'clock, violence between protesters who had already assembled in in Emancipation Park by about 8:30, and counter-protesters who had probably assembled even before that or sooner or around that time, began as early as 9:30 in the morning.
Yeah. I should add, I was on the grounds of UVA the morning after, kind of inspecting the place, and there was, it was totally clear of protesters. There was a modest, what I call modest police presence. They were obviously, most of them headed toward Lee Park by that, toward Emancipation Park by that point.
You're doing it too now.
Yeah, toward Emancipation Park by that point. But the UVA itself was basically clear. There were student relays going on, other events. You almost wouldn't have known what had happened the previous night.
No.
So the protesters are gathering in Emancipation Park. Counter-protesters are mobilizing. The police are preparing for the worst.
The police are preparing for the worst. They're given do not engage orders unless it turns violent, which we will talk about, like I said, in a few minutes. And then violence breaks out between protesters and counter-protesters. They fight for an hour at the very least. People are being sprayed with pepper spray. There are improvised flamethrowers. Many of the white supremacists are carrying firearms, rifles. They're armed to the teeth. They've got knives.
I should add, when we say firearms, we mean AR-15s.
We mean AR-15s, AK-47s.
We mean militia who are outfitted for conflict.
We mean that it is difficult to tell the difference between riot police and white nationalists.
Yes.
There are shields.
Except the riot police had police on their uniforms. That's pretty much the only way.
The white
but they were carrying. They were very, very well armed. I should add at this point, as this protest is gathering in Charlottesville, there were many white nationalist activists who were quoted as saying, "We're at war. We're at a war," and they were assembling at this event, and I will call it an event.
They were also,
it was not a rally, as our title suggests. It was not a rally. It was a battle.
They are quoted as saying they are at war, and they are quoted as saying, "We don't want to kill them, but we will if we have to." And as we've talked about with threat perception from these people, that's
not a defensive statement.
That's not a defensive statement. It's
by any objective measure.
No. So violence begins. It's unknown whether or not the left or right began the violence. I would say that it was most likely the right.
I want to dwell on this point for a second.
Sure,
if we might get a little philosophical.
Please, why not?
When I have an older sister.
Yes.
I promise I'm making a point here. When my sister and I would get into a fight, as a lot of young siblings do when we were younger, what do inevitably we say to our parents?
He started it or she started it?
Does this matter?
No.
Is this any defense?
No.
Of violent acts?
Well, Thomas, don't you remember what would happen in elementary school when you would have a fight with another child? You would both get punished.
Yes.
Because it doesn't matter who started it. It matters whether or not you retaliated. Because
exactly.
retaliation
And I want you to characterize the retaliation and the violence specifically by the alt-right. And this is getting into the point about which side was committing greater violence and had greater intent to commit violence.
Well, out of the 35 plus people hospitalized, I think maybe one of them was an alt-right member.
That's a pretty significant figure.
Yeah.
It's your belief that people assembled at this rally with the intent to commit violence.
It is my belief that people assembled at this rally, they brought guns, they brought firearms, they brought weapons to a town, to a city that was not their own, with the intent to commit violence. Yes.
That's going to be really important when we talk about free speech in a second. But why don't you just continue to describe the events on Saturday as they unfolded? Skirmishes have broken out.
Skirmishes have broken out. Violence is beginning. The city of Charlottesville holds an emergency meeting and declares a citywide state of emergency, which mobilizes riot police, mobilizes SWAT teams.
We should say Governor Terry McAuliffe declared a state of emergency shortly after.
He declared it slightly before the protest was slated to begin at 12 o'clock.
Okay.
Yes. I think the Charlottesville declaration was closer to 11, though. So you essentially have police now breaking up protesters, saying this rally cannot continue in Emancipation Park, and they were being moved to another park. Thomas, do you remember the name of the other park they were being moved to by any chance?
Well, I think they were moving to McIntyre Park. I don't believe they were moved. I believe they moved themselves.
They were told to disperse and move to McIntyre Park by police.
Oh, they were told. Okay.
They were told
so they're moving to McIntyre Park.
They're moving to McIntyre
Describe about like the distance from Emancipation Park to McIntyre Park.
I'm actually unfamiliar with the distance.
Okay, so it's a few miles, and you have to pass cars and traffic and go through residential areas. Charlottesville, the way it's set up, there's a lot of residential areas near business areas.
There's a lot of one-way roads too.
Yeah, so you had white nationalists, militia, and neo-Nazis walking by people's houses. You had them walking several miles. You had them walking by cars that were honking and shouting abuse, maybe even some supporting them. So you now have a parade going on.
It's a Nazi parade.
Yes.
Best kind of parade.
Yeah. And probably we can safely say a military parade going on.
I think we might have more guns than a military parade, to be honest with you.
Yeah, really. All they were missing was a tank.
Well, they probably each had more than one weapon, to be honest with you.
Yes. I think just to point out an anecdotal story that you and I have, during this transition between the two parks, that we had two friends of ours who witnessed this movement of people. Do you want to recount what happened there?
Yeah, two of our friends decided to record the Nazi parade.
We're not going to mention their names.
No, their names shall be kept confidential. And one of them, they were.
One of our friends is non-white.
One of our friends is non-white, and the other one is a white man with a voice that the Nazis would not like. Let's put it that way.
A voice like mine.
A voice like Thomas's. While they were recording the Nazi parade, there was a flag with the neo swastika symbol, the one that looks like a triangle with various different intersecting sides, that was slightly furled, so the video wasn't recording it properly. Our non-white friend said, "Oh, they can't see that flag," and moved as if he was going to move forwards to better observe it. And our white friend grabbed him by the shoulder and said, "Don't get any closer." And this person is one of the kindest, most gentle,
both of them.
They're both fantastic people. This is one of the happiest people I've ever met, and he sounded terrified.
Yeah. He was afraid for his friend. He was afraid for our friend's life.
Yeah.
Just for coming up to the window in his house as these people were marching by.
Yes. So
that kind of indicates the environment that we were. I think that might tellingly indicate the environment that was going on here.
It was
there
not
were lots of white nationalists and neo-Nazis marching.
I mean, if we might share one story from that Vice documentary we mentioned earlier.
Yes, which we strongly recommend.
There was a neo-Nazi supporter on the phone in McIntyre Park with what I believe were probably police or authorities. And he said, if you don't let my friends out, I'm going to send 200 people with guns over to get them.
The Vice documentary is called Charlottesville Race and Terror from Vice News,
which is a very appropriate title for this.
Yes, I think that's a very appropriate title. So they're moving toward McIntyre Park.
Then the governor declares his state of emergency.
Yeah,
and all protests are canceled because the state of emergency was declared not to limit people's freedom of speech, but to ensure the safety of the citizens and visitors to the Commonwealth of Virginia.
So I think we're at a little after 1 p.m., and there are still many counter-protesters downtown. So describe what happens as they're dispersing.
Well, and this is where our episode gets
This is the part that I think much of the audience is aware of.
Even darker. So there's a group of protesters heading up 4th Street, which is a one-way street that links between Market Street and Business 250.
This is across the downtown. This is on the downtown mall.
This is on the downtown mall. It's very close to the East Main Street Promenade.
Yeah.
And as these protesters are walking up, blocking parts of the road, surging across onto the sidewalk, because there are quite a few of them, chanting, "Whose streets? Our streets," a gray Charger comes over the speed limit, smashes into a car in front of it, which in turn hits a car in front of it, killing Heather Heyer and injuring 19 other of these protesters.
So at this point, we're now describing the worst thing at the rally, and I think the worst thing I've seen that's happened, among the worst things I've seen happen in American public life in my lifetime. And I would like for you to describe in detail what you have seen and what the reaction on the alt-right has been to this, and why it is so totally implausible and disgusting. This is the hardest part to discuss, but I think the greatest contribution we have to make and the strongest indictment of the alt-right that I can think of.
I will try and keep my calm. The reaction I've seen from the alt-right is almost uniform, and that reaction is to defend the actions of the driver, who is believed
James
to be
Fields, allegedly
Alex
James
Fields Jr. Yes. Allegedly James Fields.
Yes.
He's the suspect in custody. He was apprehended in a car that matched the exact description of the car that was given by witnesses and appears to be confirmed through video testimony. The defenses I have seen for Mr. Fields' actions range from self-defense to not wanting to commit a traffic violation because he was on a one-way street. And every single one of these defenses falls woefully short of even the incredibly reasonable bar of a reasonable doubt to Mr. Fields' intentions and Mr. Fields' actions.
Or the perpetrator,
or the perpetrator, if it was not, in fact, Mr. Fields.
So this falls into the category, then, I think, of kind of ideological self-delusion.
This falls into the category of ideological self-delusion, and it's even more disgusting than that. In the alt-right episode, we sort of talked a little bit about how the alt-right defines itself by its enemies. This is the alt-right defending a white nationalist murderer simply because the left thinks he's guilty. I don't know how else to say that.
Yeah. These defenses are neither plausible, possible, or justifiable in any way.
No, and we can
this murder. I have to add. I walked on the downtown mall just yesterday, where this occurred. I saw where this girl died. This is at the bottom of a hill. He drove down a hill. There was no way he could have not seen this large group of people.
Video evidence reveals the fact that there were not that many people walking along East Main Street. He would have definitely been able to see down the hill entirely.
There is, yeah, and I'm sure many of our listeners have seen the video of this occurring. There is no way a reasonable person can look at this video and not say that it was murder.
No.
None.
Or at the very least, manslaughter.
Yes. I don't know how anyone can say that this was self-defense. I don't know how anyone can say that this car was under attack.
What our listeners,
that was plainly not the case.
What our listeners might not know, and what Thomas will confirm, is that 4th Street is not as much of a dead end as it seems to be once you turn onto it. There is, in fact, a wide alley, wide enough for at the very least 2 cars.
2 to 3 cars.
2 to 3 cars to pass into it. That alley takes you alongside of 4th Street onto 5th Street. From 5th Street, you can very easily get back onto Business 250. So if the driver had in fact taken a wrong turn or taken a turn to avoid danger on 250, he could have easily rejoined that road without hurting the protesters. Had he noticed the protesters and cared, he could have easily turned off of the road into the alleyway and continued along his merry way without ever breaking a single traffic law. However, and I must stress this, it is not a reasonable thing to do to drive a car into a crowd of people on a one-way street.
No.
You pull over to the side of the street into one of the unused parking spaces and allow the crowd to pass, or you stop the car and reverse it. He could have reversed it into the alley. He could have reversed all the way back up the road because as far as we can see, there was no one behind him.
He did, in fact, reverse. He hit them at speed and then reversed away.
He fled the scene of the crime.
It is, as I said, it is very difficult to view this, not to say that this perpetrator who was upset at this event being dispersed intended to attack his ideological opponents.
It is incredibly hard to not view it in that
light.
But
I think the critical thing here that I have to underlie why this is...
Thomas, I need to say the most disgusting part of this
Please.
First. So, initially, after reports of the crash happened, the alt-right started by blaming the usual suspects. I believe Islamic people were blamed at one point. And then there was a very, very long-held rumor. A internet detective on 4chan decided to track down the initial buyer of the gray Dodge Charger with Ohio State license plates, determined that it was, in fact, a left-wing person from that state, and then proceeded to circulate that information to right-wing news outlets. We're not even talking with the legitimacy of Breitbart. We're talking stuff like Big League Politics.
Yeah.
And basically sites that might as well be blogs if they're not actually blogs masquerading as news sites.
These are alt-right sources.
These are alt-right sources. These are far-right sources. These have no credibility whatsoever.
Yeah.
And they reported, and I will use this terminology, and it's incredibly callous, and I apologize to our listeners, and it's very hard for me to say this. They reported that the driver was a left-wing protester who got confused and missed. He meant to hit a right-wing group of people and instead killed some of his own.
Yeah.
That is what they said.
I think the thing to underlie here, and it further makes the point with this disinformation, and I think it's fair to call it that, these lies that are being spread.
Fake news.
Yeah.
Actual fake news.
Yeah. Is they are unwilling to accept, and they are willing to excuse violence committed by someone among their supporters because it was against people they don't like.
Yes.
If it was violence, it was either from the other side,
Mhm.
or it was somehow in defense, even when real evidence shows it.
Yeah.
I think that's if that's not the demonization paradigm, I really don't know what is.
It's the demonization paradigm. It's the worst version of the demonization paradigm I think I've ever seen.
Yeah.
And that includes examining places like El Salvador, places where there's significant political violence. This was a disgusting.
Yeah, I have to add. Yeah, I have to really add that this bears a lot of similarity to political violence in other countries that are generally, at least until recently, less stable than this country.
There were unsubstantiated reports that people were shooting at individuals who were fleeing into the UVA hospital. And because of what had already occurred, people believed these reports when they would have otherwise seemed completely ridiculous. There are not enough words in my vocabulary and in the English language to condemn what happened on this day. It's horrific. And it didn't. And as Thomas will probably now ask me, our president didn't exactly make it very much better.
Yeah. So I want you to describe Donald Trump's multiple reactions to these events.
Okay.
And other reactions in American public life, but specifically President Trump's, and why you think he's reacted in the way he has.
So, President Donald Trump began a press conference, impromptu press conference, really, that was supposed to be about...
This is on Saturday.
On Saturday. This was supposed to be about signing a bill. In his tweet, he did tweet about the violence. He said what was happening in Charlottesville was sad, and that we all needed to come together as Americans, which, you know, that's not terrible, but it's not enough. And then he said that the White House strongly condemns the violence that is occurring today in Charlottesville, Virginia, on many sides. And then repeated himself, on many sides.
These have been the words that have initiated such controversy, and that, as we've already discussed so far, are a completely false characterization, a false equivalency, and are frankly hateful and insulting to the people who were injured and the young woman who was killed in Charlottesville.
He never mentioned the young woman who was killed in Charlottesville either during this this impromptu statement from which his and this is perhaps even more distressing, which his advisors and his aides say was entirely off the cuff. This is Donald Trump speaking from the heart here.
Yeah.
So there's naturally a Twitter firestorm ignites. John McCain makes a fantastically worded statement on Facebook. Governor Terry McAuliffe condemns the statement
of Virginia
that condemns Donald Trump's statement, makes a very strong one saying that there is no room in the Commonwealth of Virginia for bigotry and racism, and calls for these white nationalists, these white supremacists, these KKK supporters to go home because they're not wanted here. Paul Ryan makes some statements saying that there is no equivalence. You cannot do that. Mitt Romney comes out strongly against white supremacy. Orrin Hatch comes strongly against white supremacy, and Trump
to name a few others. To name a few others, Senator Cory Gardner of Colorado.
Cory Gardner, yes.
to the this I heard this morning, and it's astonishing. The heads of all branches of the military have issued statements. The head of the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and the head of the Coast Guard have all issued statements specifically condemning neo-Nazis and white supremacy and racism.
Ivanka Trump issued a statement specifically condemning white nationalism
A
and
bride,
white supremacy.
a bride of Prime Minister Theresa May of the United Kingdom and other world leaders have come out against it. So really, you're seeing the full gamut here. You're seeing large numbers of Republicans. I should add that there are several House Republicans who have backed up the president's statements, but the vast majority of Republican officials, former Republican presidential candidates, nonpartisan figures in the military, and many other figures, and as we mentioned in the beginning of the episode, heads of business, much of American public life has come out to condemn white supremacy, white nationalism, neo-Nazis, and the violent and hateful ideology that they preach. And the president refused to condemn them for 48 hours. So what happened next, Josh?
So he's silent on Sunday as this entire firestorm is brewing. And then on Monday, the CEO of Merck Chemical,
yes,
his name escapes me, Thomas. What's his name again?
It's Fraser, something Fraser.
Fraser, decides to leave the president's economic council, citing that the president has not condemned white supremacy and that he cannot operate in such an environment. It is worth pointing out that Mr. Fraser is one of the nation's only Fortune 500 black CEOs.
Yes.
And Donald Trump immediately takes to Twitter to condemn the CEO of Merck Chemical, stating that, oh, good, now you can get to work on not ripping off Americans with prescription prices. And
so again, you're seeing a reaction based on loyalty here.
Loyalty is going to be
a
theme.
He was just a few weeks ago or in recent months congratulating Merck on keeping jobs in the United States. And it's Kenneth Frazier. Kenneth Frazier is his name. And the moment this CEO, Kenneth Frazier, says as a matter of personal conscience and belief that he can't serve with the president anymore because of his poor reaction to Charlottesville, the president lashes out in a vicious way. Mm-hmm. And whatever you think of Merck's prescription drug prices, it's the context in which that criticism occurred that's really more important here.
And he also alleges that Merck is in fact not keeping jobs in the U.S. at all.
So I want to. There was somebody else who had a different reaction to President Trump's statements. David Duke.
Oh God.
The head.
Yes.
I have a statement here. The head of the Ku Klux Klan for many, many years, and a voice of white supremacy in American politics for decades.
And
he said on Twitter.
Unite the Right rally.
Yeah, he was present, and he said on Twitter, "Thank you, President Trump, for your honesty and courage to tell the truth about at Charlottesville and to condemn the leftist terrorists in BLM/Antifa." And he said this on Twitter. And there have been other far-right figures, including Ann Coulter, Richard Spencer, and Tim Gillette, who all issued statements of praise for President Trump on Twitter. Oh, I actually have Ann Coulter's statement here. Ann Coulter, we were Gideon's army without Gideon. Today we got our leader back at Real Donald Trump press conference. So I think we can safely say Ann Coulter is a white supremacist on the alt-right at this point. Probably a safe assumption.
Probably a safe assumption, yeah.
And we should remind our listeners, Ann Coulter, who famously called the widows of 9/11 witches, among other controversies.
Yeah, there's quite a few of her, aren't there?
So the alt-right, white supremacists and neo-Nazis they noticed that the president didn't specifically call them out. They noticed that he made this false equivalency.
Well, the most shocking thing is that Trump almost seemed like he was going to condemn white supremacy. So David Duke tweets at him saying that, remember who got you elected. It wasn't the leftists, essentially. And then Trump backs down and doesn't actually condemn them. So what happens after the Merck Chemical situation is Twitter explodes because Trump has now rejoined Twitter after his hiatus, and rather than using his time to, tweet a condemnation of white supremacy, he instead decides to attack a person who crossed him. And because of this, Donald Trump determines on Monday that he's going to make a statement about Charlottesville in which he does explicitly condemn neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and the KKK. But he does not do so of his own free will. He does so because the Twitter firestorm has reached inferno level.
We should just add, it's not just Twitter here. We're talking about much of American life.
Yes.
We're talking about his family. We're talking about across the spectrum.
His
Donald Trump is being pressured into an apocalypse. So I want to draw a comparison here because it's not enough.
Thomas.
Sure.
You might even say that the firestorm had developed into a giant flaming ball of death.
You might. But with the president's behavior, it's really not enough just to say how sick, disgusting, and hateful it is. We have to maybe go into the thankless task of trying to explain why.
But we're also not done with his statements. He made one on Tuesday, Thomas.
Yes, he did. But before we get into Tuesday, I want to figure out what happened on Monday. So I was reminded when he made this apology after the outcry of the Access Hollywood scandal during the election. These are two very different events, but much like with Access Hollywood, the president had universal condemnation, including from his own party, and he faced overwhelming pressure. It wasn't a usual, typical level of bullshit polarization that we have in politics, where Republicans make some kind of justification or equivocation spinelessly for horrible things that Donald Trump has.
Paul Ryan's spine.
In whatever universe Paul Ryan's spine is located in right now. But he was facing condemnation from across the spectrum, and he was basically coerced into an apology. And Donald Trump doesn't like that very much, does he?
No, he does not. He hates it, as a matter of fact.
So do you think that might play a role into what happened on Tuesday and to where we seem to be now?
Yes, it does. On Tuesday, he held a press conference in which he called the media fake news again, which is really just par for the course at this point. By the way, can we remind our listeners that how sad the fact it is that this is par for the course at this point with our president?
Extremely. I don't think they need to be reminded, but
it's upsetting.
We might say it.
It's upsetting.
Yeah.
So he decided to make a statement that, as a matter of fact, he was mainly talking about everyone's violence, and he coined a new term, or tried to coin a new term. I don't think it's sticking very much. The alt-left. Thomas, what do you think the alt-left is?
Something, a nebulous category that has been made up by the president and his supporters to draw a false equivalency with the alt-right.
Yes.
It is. Well, it's just a sort of abbreviation that characterizes a conspiracy that Antifa and Black Lives Matter are somehow equivalent to the alt-right in their ideology, their numbers, and violence, which it's none of those things.
He also attempted to excoriate the press for not properly reporting on the violence against right-wing activists in the Unite the Right rally. He claimed that the media was not
kind of proves there's really nothing that Trump can't blame the media for.
Nope. It also claims that there's nothing he won't turn into a false controversy. And then he walked back his statements on Monday, specifically mentioning left-wing protesters, the alt-left, and saying that if the media covered things properly, they would entirely agree with his statement that condemned violence on all sides. And then we get to another thorny issue, which is the fact that Donald Trump has decided that the only reason for the Unite the Right rally was to protect the Lee statue in Emancipation Park.
All right, so Josh, I want to really directly address an issue here.
Sure, please.
Was this rally about the Lee statue?
No. This rally was not about the Lee statue.
What was this rally about, Josh?
This rally was about, one, demonstrating that the alt-right white nationalists and neo-Nazis are more than just an internet presence, and two, about protecting white culture from erasure. They equate the Lee statue with white culture being erased. That's why they chanted, "You will not replace us, Jews will not replace us." And it was about a show of force to the left, that they will not go down without a fight.
All right, so now I want to ask a broader and more philosophical question.
Please.
We really owe it to our listeners to kind of give them context of what's going on here.
Sure.
I think maybe you could reiterate a little on the beliefs and the perceptions about, in the alt-right's point of view, what's happening to the United States with changing demographics and immigration, the deep sense of threat that they feel from this, and why they might be so motivated, and why it's so dangerous.
So, the alt-right is typically white men, I would say.
I think it's a fairly safe assumption. Vast majority of members are white men.
There are definitely women in the movement. They're praised to high heaven because they're women and also members of the alt-right, which automatically proves that the alt-right isn't sexist. And the same with black members of the alt-right, which, yes, they do exist. Again, praised to high heaven, upheld as signs that the alt-right's not racist.
By far, most members of the alt-right are white men.
White men, generally with some college education at the very least. They tend to be a fairly educated movement.
Which isn't to say that their ideas are good.
No, and they're also not a very wealthy movement, necessarily. A lot of them come from, I would say, lower middle class backgrounds, trade schools. A
group that's kind of feeling the pinch with the global economy.
Yes, and that's part of the reason why I think their reactionism is so strong here. They see immigrants as, I mean, just take a South Park term, immigrants are coming into the country to take their jobs.
Yes.
And they view them as an inherent threat.
But this goes well beyond economic anxiety.
Yes, it does. They also see them as an inherent threat to Western values. We talked about in the alt-right episode that the alt-right views Islam as fundamentally opposed to democracy, and that democracy and Islam cannot coexist.
Yeah.
They also think things like black people are more likely to commit crime, and they don't understand the link between race and class in this country. They make a lot of racist assumptions, saying that if Black Lives Matter really wanted to preserve black crime, they would turn their focus inwards on their communities. I believe
this is a really heinous idea that African Americans are inherently more violent.
I believe I've heard it expressed as, if you want to fix things, get out of the street and go back to the ghetto. Which sounds horrible. Like, that sounds...
Well, it's an attitude, and it's probably at the core of their ideology, that all problems that minorities face are their fault, and probably because of some kind of inherent intrinsic quality.
Well,
is that accurate?
Actually, Thomas, it's more than accurate. They think minorities are privileged in American society. They believe that...
Fact check, maybe that's not the case.
Fact check? I mean, yeah. Oh, you mean actuality. No, that tends not to be the case, as a matter of fact. They see affirmative action and the like as institutions and programs that discriminate against white men unfairly. They allow for black individuals in particular to attain posts, positions, spots at prestigious universities that they should not be obtaining.
This idea that minorities are getting more than they deserve.
Yes, more than they deserve.
A very, very problematic view that's widespread in American society, well beyond the alt-right.
Yes, it goes beyond the alt-right, but I have found that every single alt-right member holds this view, which is why, one of the other reasons why I am very, very okay with saying that the alt-right is probably pretty racist.
All right, so I've described this set of views and we've described the reaction of the president. So I want to ask you another tough question based on our previous podcast. Are you ready?
Yes, please.
I asked you in episode 1 of Tangents if you believe Donald Trump is alt-right. Are you now prepared to characterize Donald Trump as an alt-right president?
I am now prepared to say that Donald Trump
carries... Who knows what he believes, but in his actions.
Yes, in his actions, I was about to contextualize that. I was about to say Donald Trump carries such a deep loyalty to the alt-right, who have remained behind him through thick and thin, that he will support their actions and defend their obvious misdeeds, regardless of the firestorm of criticism he gets. So yes, I would say that in his actions, in his words, in his defenses, Donald Trump can basically be understood as an essentially alt-right president.
So I'm going to broaden this out a little bit in our last two questions.
Sure.
You and I had a conversation the day this event occurred, and you said something very telling to me. You said, of American political life, I don't know that anything will ever be the same after this, that this event was a turning point. So that's kind of what I was wondering if you can elaborate on that idea a little bit. Was this a turning point? Does this really change American politics and American public life in a profound way? I mean, if I might elaborate, we had an event here that showed that racism and violence are no longer at the margins of American life. That I think, honestly, what I think of as kind of the culture war turned into a real war. Yeah. And it is the centerpiece of everything we talked about now.
I think I still agree with my previous statement. What I was referring to was the fact that in the United States of America, we have the incredible fortune of living in a place where to make a political point, to make a point to the government, to make a point to our peers, we go out onto the streets and we can picket and we can protest and we can talk reasonably to one another, or we can talk angrily.
We won't face Tiananmen Square.
We won't face Tiananmen Square. We don't have to go out and kill each other. And Charlottesville is the antithesis of that. Charlottesville is the opposite. Charlottesville is two groups of people who were not able to talk because one of them came with the intent for violence and the other needed to defend themselves. I mean, this fundamentally changes American political dynamics because now, previously we talked about how anti-fascists and Antifa and whatnot are not typically as violent as the alt-right, but who's to say that that's the case anymore, Thomas? They could perceive a threat now. One of their number was killed. They were beaten. They brought the fascists brought guns. Who's to say that the anti-fascists won't start bringing guns, won't start bringing more weapons? And it just escalates, and it gets worse and worse and worse. On a more positive note,
there are other Confederate monuments. There are other rallies planned. There are other potential flashpoints.
There are 9 rallies planned for this weekend alone.
Yeah.
And who's to say that it's going to stop at one death?
And a broader part of the American public has very different perceptions of what happened here.
Yes. And
this isn't just groups of protesters with crazy ideas and violent intentions. Large numbers of people in the American public, as we speak, Fox News is spreading a pretty disingenuous narrative about what happened in Charlottesville, and right-wing media like Breitbart are spreading a disingenuous narrative about what happened in Charlottesville.
And conspiracy theory websites like Zero Hedge are spreading ridiculously disingenuous narratives about what's happening in Charlottesville.
So there's a broad section of the American public that have very different views of what happened here and have support for different sides in potentially violent conflict. Mm-hmm. We could see more of this going forward.
On a more positive note, Donald Trump might have found the one thing that Democrats and Republicans can still agree on, and that's that Nazis are bad. So it seems as though as long as this remains an issue and as long as Donald Trump keeps this a political issue, which given his propensity to just randomly bring things up, seems reasonably likely. He might have finally turned elements of Congress against him that he cannot actually get back under his control. And that could change things in a much better way. And I'm not just talking about a potential impeachment here.
We've talked about Paul Ryan and his missing spine, and about Republican leaders.
If Paul Ryan's spine would like to appear on Tangents Podcast, please send us an email at tangentscontact@gmail.com.
As much as I appreciate Paul Ryan's words in a very obvious statement in condemning neo-Nazis and white supremacists,
which our president failed to make,
Paul Ryan needs to back them with actions. Paul Ryan has power to make Donald Trump's life miserable, and he has not used it, and neither has Mitch McConnell. I have to add, even Jeff Sessions condemned the events in Charlottesville, which is a bit like which is a bit like J. Edgar Hoover condemning the KKK.
Yes.
And there was an analyst at this event who pointed out, Jeff Sessions is doing everything in his power to stop people of color from having the right to vote and to strongly enhance immigration restrictions. Mm-hmm. So kind of mean and taking away oversight of police departments. So it's pretty meaningless. Attorney General Sessions
has also stated that has also opened an investigation into the death in Charlottesville, the murder of Heather Heyer, and has stated today that this crime might be considered a hate crime, in addition to a potential act of terrorism.
Which is, I think, fair. Of course it is.
I think it's incredibly fair. I also think that Donald Trump is probably not very happy that Jeff Sessions said that.
So going forward, Josh.
Wait. One thing first, Thomas.
Sure.
We said we would talk about the left-wing responses to things, and the police presence. We still need to do that.
So specifically, can you address, and we'll talk about other left-wing responses in a second, but I want you to specifically address the criticism of the police at these rallies, at the rally in Charlottesville.
All that I have to say is that Governor Terry McAuliffe of Virginia reported that 80% of white supremacists brought a firearm with them, and not a single shot was fired on Saturday. Police, when they're supervising a protest, have two extremes that they must avoid and a very narrow middle ground they have to act on. The first extreme is they do nothing. They essentially allow the violence to happen. There's examples of this throughout history. Perhaps one of the best ones is UN troops in Rwanda simply turning over Tutsi to be massacred by Hutu and leaving.
Yeah, we'll be talking about Rwanda in a different episode. But you think here that the police response was adequate?
I think the police response was more than adequate because they
could they have stopped that car crash?
No.
This is in the video. In the video of the car crash and in this report from Vice News, one of the first things an activist said afterward is, why didn't the police protect us? They protected the outsiders, but they didn't protect us. Is that fair?
No, that is an entirely unfair thing. In order for the police to have
maybe understandable given what the poor woman had just seen.
It's entirely understandable. She was nearly killed by a car, but it's entirely incorrect because the police also had to avoid the second extreme, which is what we saw happen at the Kent State protests back during the Vietnam War, and that is,
we should add, that was the National Guard.
Yeah, and that is to become a third actor in a riot or a second actor in a protest.
And when the police use force, it tends to be much greater than anything protesters could bring to bear.
Mm-hmm. So the police's goal is not only to prevent stop the already occurring violence between protesters and counter-protesters, but also to prevent further violence and, most importantly, to prevent the escalation of that violence. We only saw one death due to this car crash. I think the police did their job at preventing the escalation of violence when 80% of white supremacists or more might have had a weapon. I think they did a very, very good job there. And additionally, how are the police supposed to prevent a man from crashing his car into a crowd of people.
I think it's like preventing any kind of terrorist attack. It's a pretty thankless task.
Yes, they would have had to have anticipated the terrorist attack, and they would have had to move the protesters out of the street, and it may not have even worked then, because he may have just directed himself towards the sidewalk, to be honest with you, Thomas.
We have seen, I think you did a really good job highlighting probably the understandable, although problematic, increased threat that Antifa and other left-wing groups have in response to this event. There's a lot we could go into with this, but I want to address a basic legal and philosophical point.
Please.
In the aftermath of Charlottesville.
Yes.
But I have to start with a premise.
Okay.
Here on Tangents, we are very strong advocates of free speech and the First Amendment. Incredibly strong. We wouldn't have this podcast without it. We believe intensely in the ability of people with controversial points of view to air them. Do you think that our society should continue to allow rallies like this to take place?
Yes, I do.
Do these people have a right to speak?
They have a right to speak. They have a right to nothing else other than that.
And that's important because that's not what happened here.
No, they did not speak. This rally should have been shut down due to a threat to public safety, and it was shut down because of a threat to public safety, because despite the fact that they hired speakers, despite the fact that they said that they came prepared to be peaceful, the white nationalists, the white supremacists, and the neo-Nazis at Charlottesville were not peaceful, and they came looking for a fight.
But what's the balance, and how do you tell?
The horrible thing about it is that you actually can't tell if a side intends violence until the violence begins.
So do we have to have just large numbers of police at every Confederate monument around the country? Do communities, and there's no easy answer, but do communities and people like our friends have to endure having hundreds of people marching through their neighborhoods with swastikas, with nooses, with Confederate flags, shouting racial slurs? Is that what the First Amendment demands of us?
No. No, it does not demand that of us. It does not demand that of us because they do not, in order for a person to have a right to speak and a right to assemble, they need not necessarily assemble on public grounds. It's entirely conceivable that there could be a city ordinance, or if a city decides that it might be, in fact, too threatening to allow a protest, to restrict that protest to private grounds only. I think that that's probably what you're going to see after Charlottesville. I also think that we need to have these groups explicitly submit very, very, very detailed plans of their protest, and that includes any marches they may be committing, any entry routes by which people might reach the areas that they're going to, and things like that, so those areas can be cleared, so police presence can be properly established, and so that can be properly weighed when determining whether or not to give these groups a permit to protest in a public area. I already mentioned the fact that the Unite the Right rally deviated from its course at the University of Virginia, choosing instead of going up University Avenue to go up McCormick Road and onto the lawn. If that occurred under this new system, I think that alone would be grounds to terminate the protest and revoke the permit immediately. They have violated the terms of their agreement. I think we're really going to see a crackdown on what is allowed and what is not allowed, but we should not, I repeat, we should not see a categorical ban on a certain type of speech.
Well, I want to ask the other question then.
Sure.
You've established for me that the alt-right is predominantly violent.
Yes, I have.
Should we ban groups, organizations, and individuals who we know are associated with this? Should someone like Richard Spencer or Kessler or other figures simply be banned from holding events in the future, and their organizations? If a group, an organization, or an individual has been known to engage in racist violence in the past, should they just be denied a priori a permit on that grounds?
That's a more difficult question. I think it's entirely reasonable if they're denied a priori a permit on that ground. I don't think it needs to be a necessity, because as we said, even though the alt-right is prone to violence, they are not inherently violent. Not every member of the alt-right is a violent person.
No, but if a person like Richard Spencer, for instance, I'm not talking about just saying,
okay.
I don't know how you can't test, you can't take a blood test and determine if somebody's on the alt-right.
If only we could.
You can't,
No,
and
we
you
cannot.
shouldn't, and you shouldn't.
No, we should not.
But if an individual in their own capacity has committed racist violence in the past, that might be enough to deny them a speaking slot, is my question.
Yes, I agree with that entirely.
Okay.
And if they are admitted to a speaking slot, there needs to be a police presence, and they themselves need to be protected because there could be retaliatory violence against them. And also there needs to be an increased presence around that event because of the tendency for it to become violent. But I think it's entirely fine if cities and towns deny alt-right, far-right, and neo-Nazi, white supremacist, and white nationalist groups the right to protest around their Confederate monuments. I don't think that's abridging their freedom of speech. I think that is more a concern for public safety, given that we've seen the violence that we've seen in Charlottesville. We don't want to make this into a pattern, Thomas.
Banning groups, you mean?
Heavily restricting. I wouldn't say an outright ban.
I guess, and I'm getting into the realm of hypotheticals here.
Sure.
The problem with this event, compared to the Ku Klux Klan protesting in Charlottesville a few months ago, is the number of people involved.
Mm-hmm.
You can confirm to me very easily that there's a lot of people on the alt-right.
Yes.
We're fairly sure from surveys and so on that there are large numbers of Americans who sympathize with this. When you start talking about thousands and thousands of people showing up, and I'm kind of thinking of the elections of 2020 when I say this, and Trump rallies.
Yeah.
When you start potentially talking about massive numbers of people, doesn't this become problematic? Like, our current system on hate speech, our current system on these types of rallies usually works pretty well when you have a couple of dozen fat Klan members showing up and waving Confederate flags. It doesn't work as well when you have larger numbers of people.
Yeah. I think there needs to be a reconsideration of these laws. I also think that it might be acceptable if they want a specific venue to limit the size of a protest or a gathering. Part of the reason why Charlottesville filed a suit against part of the reason why Charlottesville tried to remove the permit of these white nationalist groups is because there were just too many of them for Emancipation Park. Emancipation Park is not a very big park. Thomas can attest to that. And
no, it's not.
And there's going to be 1,000+ people crammed inside this little park. In order to make them all fit, they'd have to stack themselves like a Jenga tower. A very white Jenga tower. They would not, and something tells me the alt-right would not do this, as a matter of fact. So I don't necessarily think that we need to completely strike the laws and start over again, but we certainly do need to consider the fact that these individuals have been pushed out of the fringe of American politics into, if not the mainstream, very close to it.
So I think, as a way of closing, I might read for a second from the memorial for Heather Heyer.
Please.
And I think I could say this generally of many brave people with no violent intents who showed up in Charlottesville knowing they'd be outnumbered to resist hate and racism and violence. Heather Heyer's mother said at the memorial, "They tried to kill my child to shut her up. Well, guess what? You've just magnified her." And I think that speaks to political violence generally. It never achieves its objective. It never silences people who are trying to fight for justice. It only turns against those who commit it. And I think, Josh, you would agree with me. It's safe to say that maybe they might have increased recruiting, but the alt-right had a big loss this weekend.
Yeah. However, and this is
their movement was hurt by this.
Absolutely. Regardless of what
and they've shown us who they really are.
Regardless of what they might say, they suffered a grave defeat this evening, or the evening of Saturday. And
all right, thank you, Josh.
You're quite welcome, Thomas.
And now it's time for the intellectual buffet. We'll try to bring the mood up a little bit after that very sober discussion.
Yeah.
Josh, what have you brought to the intellectual buffet?
More neo-Nazis. Or rather, I would if they weren't taken off the internet.
Yay.
The Daily Stormer, one of the, I believe it touts itself as the most genocidal news source in America, was in fact completely taken down. And this occurred as a result of...
Its domain name was revoked by GoDaddy. It's Domain Post.
And Google.
Which is not a violation of their free speech rights, I should add.
No, you don't have a right to be listed on Google, as a matter of fact. Nor do you have
you do not have a right to domain name.
And you do not have a right to own a website either.
You do not.
It's not in the Constitution, I checked.
Yeah, it's not.
But actually, the most interesting part of this story comes from the different perceptions from the neo-Nazis and the alt-right trying to rationalize the fact that the site was gone and the actual reality of what occurred. So initially, the website itself had a message from Anonymous, the famed hacking coalition that goes against corporate websites and usually supports social justice causes, saying, "We got you, Daily Stormer, #TangoDown," which is what began to trend on Twitter. Then it was revealed that actually it was, in fact, the creator of the Daily Stormer himself that had posted that message onto the Daily Stormer to try and get left
cover up.
To try and cover up the fact that their domain was revoked by GoDaddy and that they were no longer listed on Google.
Josh, are you surprised that Nazi media is actually lying to people?
I'm very unsurprised, I have to say. Given their propensities in the past, I'm not that surprised. It would not surprise me to know.
Do you have any recommendations for what the Daily Stormer's domain should be replaced with?
Yes, I do. It needs to be replaced with a website honoring storm chasers on a daily basis, because it is, after all, the Daily Stormer. Also,
or could it be stormtroopers from Star Wars, not historical stormtroopers?
It could be stormtroopers from Star Wars as well. You know, those nameless extras, they all need... that's an even better idea. You know what we should do? We should have that website, and we should have, like, a random stormtrooper, and we should give them an entire personality and a backstory. And on a daily basis, just have creative writers from across the country ply their craft on giving these men tragic backstories.
Can I say something that just occurred to me as a tangent?
Please,
okay,
please.
So the stormtroopers supposedly are clones, right?
Well, some of them.
Does this occur to you as a little bit funny that stormtroopers, which of course were Nazi troops, not Nazi police, come from a eugenics experiment in Star Wars?
It does, but Thomas, permission to Star Wars nerd for a second here.
Please, by all means, never have to ask for permission to do that.
So, the clones of Jango Fett were the original stormtroopers. However, they started to be phased out towards about the 10th or 15th year of the Empire's existence, because there simply weren't enough of them. Kamino could not supply the amount of clones. Also, Kamino held a clone rebellion in which they created clone troopers to fight against the stormtroopers, because Kamino was a loyal Republic world. This is all expanded universe at this point, which is, Legends. So it didn't actually necessarily happen, but originally, all the Imperial officers were not clones, and the stormtroopers started to...
No, the Imperial officers were all Oxbridge-educated, snobby Southern Englishmen.
Essentially, yes, and...
including Admiral Tuck, most famously.
And the stormtroopers were humans from rimworld and very, very poor humans who were either conscripted or enlisted into the galactic Imperial Army in order to get a paycheck and pay for their families. So, as a matter of fact, the Empire is literally sending peons, genetic experiments, and unwilling fighters to go and die in mass because, of course, everyone knows the Empire's strategy is strength in numbers. Very much like, ironically, the Soviet Union in World War II. But actually, there's a little bit more to this Daily Stormer story, so if I may.
Please do.
So, the reason why Daily Stormer came down so quickly after its domain name was revoked is because the website that had famously been providing it with protection from denial of service and dedicated denial of service attacks, or DOS and DDoS attacks, respectively, Cloudflare determined that they were going to, in fact, drop the Daily Stormer on an arbitrary basis after the events of Charlottesville. The CEO of Cloudflare issued a very, very interesting statement in which he said that he could not justify, based on company policy, that he was dropping the Daily Stormer, and he does not feel right necessarily dropping the Daily Stormer, but he feels as though it is something that he has to do, and that Cloudflare in the future needs to be more selective about who they provide protection to. With Cloudflare's protective proxy servers gone, the Daily Stormer very quickly succumbed to what I would assume are a massive amount of attacks against it, and is now offline, I believe, to this day. Some sources say that the Daily Stormer has reopened on the Darknet.
But so Josh, just tell our listeners real quick, what is the Darknet?
The Darknet is essentially the internet under the internet. It's unlisted websites on major search engines like Google and things like that. There's two types of darknets. There's the broader darknet, which you can get to using browsers like Tor, and there's intra-company darknets, which are like when you go inside the NSA, everything you send is technically on a darknet that loops only within the NSA, which can, of course, be accessed by other organizations within the government within certain parts of it. Darknets are a really, really great way of keeping data secure and also keeping data unseen and difficult to locate by government, anyone who's trying to find source material and things like that. You should not be able to Google search something and find a darknet website. Other things that appear on the darknet are assassination contract hits,
drugs,
lots of drugs.
Yes, lots of drugs, and even more porn.
Detailed descriptions on how to create bombs, really bad porn, child pornography, bestiality, you're not okay porn types.
So you're saying there's lots of hateful, criminal, illegal content on the darknet, but also probably people who just want to hide themselves.
Yep, the Daily Stormer should fit right in with that. As a matter of fact, the Daily Stormer might be one of the more liberal publications on the darknet.
Oh, great. All right.
So, Thomas, what have you brought to the intellectual buffet today?
I have a scandal from down under.
Oh, boy.
So, Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce of Australia recently has discovered that he is from New Zealand.
Wait, how did he not know this?
Well, he was born in New Zealand, and it was unclear if he held citizenship there, but the New Zealand High Commissioner declared recently that Joyce is indeed a New Zealander. The Australian Constitution prevents anyone from sitting in Parliament who has dual citizenship. And this has proven to be a problem for Joyce. Joyce is the leader of the National Party, which is the junior coalition party of the Liberal Party of Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. Yes, everything is backwards in Australia. The Liberal Party of Australia is quite right-wing. So Malcolm Turnbull's government has a majority of just one. So if Joyce is kicked out of Parliament, the government could fall over this, and New Zealanders will be more happy than they've been since the announcement of Lord of the Rings sequels.
Wow. So
there's no word at this time on Russian involvement in this scandal.
I was about to ask that. So you're telling me that because he was born in New Zealand, he might cause the collapse of the Australian government.
That's potentially the case.
Well, I have a feeling that a constitutional amendment may be incoming.
Yeah, I hope I hope they get gay marriage first.
Maybe they can pass it as a rider onto, the thing that is really, really stupid. Why is that so Thomas?
Sure.
Do you perchance know the history of why that's the case? That seems like a very interesting thing to include in a constitution.
That I don't. I suspect it's probably similar to a history in the United States. They wanted Australia not to be ruled by the British. And so when Australia's constitution, I think, emerged after World War I, and so they wanted native residents of Australia to represent it and not to have Brits coming in and filling the parliament. That would be my guess. I don't know that for a fact. But it's not uncommon for a lot of countries to have provisions that keep people who are only their citizens for serving in political life.
Okay. That's fair. And my final question is, of course,
sure.
Has President Donald Trump made any comment on the fact that an illegal immigrant to Australia has wormed his way up into a very high position of power?
He's not, but it wouldn't surprise me if he would be rejoicing at the fall of Malcolm Turnbull's government, as recent leaks in the Washington Post have revealed that he and Turnbull do not have the best relationship.
Which is actually quite something, because the United States and Australia tend to get along really, really
Australia
well.
is the closest ally in the history of U.S. Diplomatic relations, Josh.
All right. Well, Thomas, keep us updated on that scandal.
I will.
It would be quite interesting if Australia was to completely destroy itself.
All right. And from Tangents, we thank you very much for listening.